So, I'm all done with strangers. I had a great time with this book. This last section especially was very riveting. Overall, I would definitely say that I enjoyed this a lot more than The Woman in Cabin 10, and I hope all my future book club reads are as fun. But obviously that probably won't happen because people with different tastes will be selecting the books sometimes. Sometimes even if it's an author you like, they'll write a book that you don't like. Sometimes you'll meet a new author and their writing style completely doesn't jive with you. But in any case, strangers. So fun. So fun. And I'm super glad that there's a sequel out when I read this because I went and started reading the sequel at like midnight last night. So that's how much I like this one. Because if you didn't know, even though I mentioned it in other videos, Michael Byrne Collins' books are on sale for 99 cents on all of his electronic formats right now. So I went and bought it for 99 cents and I've already started the sequel. So I really enjoyed this and I'm really looking forward to seeing what happens in the sequel too. Anyways, let's get on to the discussion questions for this book. We have chapter 73 for the first one, where I said, what did you think of the revelation that the killer was present the night that Brian died? For me, I was a little surprised by it, but as I thought about it, I was like, it does make sense because we know he's been watching the family for a long time. I did think it was going to play out differently than is ultimately revealed because I thought the killer being there meant that Brian had had some secret too, and that Brian got killed by the killer is the very first thing. But that does not end up being the case, as we'll discuss with a further question later on. Then, for my second question, on page 282, we have the quote, then he realized he did have a choice. He always had. There was always a choice, even when the choice was between awful options, between two things that seemed worse than death. Because sometimes the true choice wasn't in the decisions presented, it was in the way that they were faced. Do you agree? Do you disagree? Have you ever been in a situation that felt like it had those kinds of choices? So, I was raised in a church that teaches very strongly that everyone has agency and we all have our own choices. And so, based on my feelings through that, I would say that I very much agree with this quote, that we always have a choice. There's always some sort of option. Even if we don't like our options, there's always a choice that we can make. And that we have to make, really, because we have our agency and our ability to choose the direction of our lives. And yes, I would say that I've been in situations with uncomfortable choices in them. Definitely not to the extent in this book. I've not really ever been in life or death, especially as strongly as in this book. But there have been times when there have been bad choices that I've felt like I've had to choose from, and that's my only options. So yeah, I would say all of it, yep. So, moving on to question 3, based on chapter 85. This goes further into the Brian stuff. What did you think of the reveal that Brian's suicide was all about the family secrets? First off, I was kind of surprised that it was suicide, because the way it was talked about in the book, sometimes it sounded like suicide, sometimes it sounded like an accident, and then he just ended up like in the pool, which wasn't entirely the case once we got the full description of it either. And then, obviously, with what I said in chapter 73, we had the killer there, and then I was like, oh, the killer caused it. But no, it was a suicide, and so it was all kind of surprising to me, I guess, in that sense. But it was probably one of the few points in the story, especially this section, that I was like, I don't know that this jives with the rest of the story for me. Because I was kind of expecting the whole that it would be the killer again thing, that Brian had some sort of secret, etc. Obviously, you don't have to make everyone fit into those things, but I'd kind of been expecting it, so it was a little bit off-putting for me, I guess, and a little bit like, this doesn't fit quite the same as everything else. But there you go. Then my next question was based on chapters 89 and 90, because the end of 89 implies what he reveals in 90, so basically I felt like they were related to combine them that way. And the question I asked here was, were you surprised by the reveal that the pregnant woman in the picture was someone that Jerry had killed while driving? And would you have told your family sooner, for example, when they found that picture, or would you have let them assume that you were an adulterer? So, yes, I was surprised by the reveal that the woman was not someone he'd been philandering with and that he'd actually accidentally killed her while driving. Everything in the book had been framing it like he was an adulterer. We talked about his wife's adultery, and it sounded like he was saying, hey, Jerry, you've done the same thing, whereas really he was just saying, I've done bad things too. So, yeah. So the way it was framed in the story, I felt like it was going to be an adultery story, and then it was not. So that definitely surprised me that he'd accidentally killed someone. And then, moving on from that, since it was an accidental killing, I was kind of surprised that he didn't just tell his family. Obviously, like at the time of it, maybe he was too ashamed to. He treated it basically like a hit and run since no one knew except for one witness. But I feel like letting them know, actually, I accidentally killed this girl would be better than being like, letting them assume that he's an adulterer, which is what the family does assume when they see the picture. I don't know. That's just me. So then we have one final question. I have actually been to writing conferences that Michael Brent Collins is at, and one of the things he talks about with horror is that he feels the best kind of horror is redemptive horror, or in other words, horror that you read and you come out feeling like you've survived something and you know you can survive hard things, or when the characters survive because of like an act of God or something. That essentially good horror is all about the ability to be redeemed. So I asked my writing group if they would consider this novel redemptive horror and why or why not. And for me personally, I definitely got the feeling of this being redemptive horror, in part because people do survive, so it's like, yes, we can survive hard and awful things. In fact, more people survived than I thought were going to survive. I thought it would probably just be Jerry, because I did have in the back of my head that they might turn out to be the family from the prologue, which was not the case at all, and is fine. Kind of better that way, really, so that it's not just like a silly frame story. But yeah, so there was that. So yeah, like people surviving, yes, redemptive stuff, but I definitely got kind of the sense that Michael Brent Collins talks about with it, that even just me reading it and me pushing through some of those scary parts, some of those more gory parts, those horror element parts, and coming out the other side and still being okay, you know, I felt like even just on my own personal end that I got some of that. So I think I would definitely personally consider this a redemptive horror. Through these questions, I do think we've talked about most of what I wanted to talk about with this section. The biggest thing with it for me was just it was so engrossing in this section. So many things were happening. It was a great climax to the story. And with so much going on, I almost forgot to even do questions, especially once we hit like the fire starting and all that section, that I pretty much just read straight through and did not think about questions or anything like that. So for me, this was probably my favorite section of the book, too, and it made a really good ending to it, and I can't really think of anything else that I want to add that we didn't already cover, so, oh, well, I guess I can talk about the killer himself, since that I kind of knew, because, again, I'd been to a writing conference with Michael Brent Collins, and at that he did a reading for the sequel, so I kind of already knew what was going on with the killer, but the book does reveal that the killer was actually 3 people, which was really fun. I liked the way that that was written, and that he talks about being one and stuff, and you don't quite know what he means, or that he doesn't want to lose his turn at doing whatever. And so it's kind of implying that maybe he's got like a multiple personality kind of thing going on, but then it turns out that there were actually 3 separate people. Oh, it was so good. It was such a fun way to have written it and to have revealed it. And so I really liked that element too. And it's going to be super interesting in the sequel too, just from that little bit that I read there. But yeah, so that's what I've got to say about Strangers. I hope that people will read it for themselves and have fun with it. I really enjoyed this book. I highly recommend it. Actually, I just kind of recommend Michael Brent Collins anyways, especially right now in quarantine. The horror stuff is just really helping me get through it. It's that whole kind of redemptive horror angle that it's like I'm reading these awful, horrible events happening to these people, and in part that helps me realize that quarantine in some ways isn't so bad. But also that if they can make it through these crazy events, like this killer coming after them and this fire in their house, then I can make it through hard things too. So that's kind of my ultimate thing from this too. But yeah, I think that's all I've got to say for now, and I hope you guys will join me in our next reading. Our next book is going to be What We Forgot to Bury. I forget who the author is, and I don't have my copy yet, so I can't just hold it up and be like, this is the one. But we're going to take a week break from that since all of us are still waiting on our copies, and then we'll be starting reading that on the 25th. So that gives you time if you want to read along too. But that's all I've got for now. This is Yuma Harper signing out.